Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you here in the room with us, or if you're joining us on our YouTube channel, or our friends viewing us on C-SPAN, welcome. Our guest author today will take a look at one of the most influential office holders in our modern era, Ronald Reagan, our 40th president. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two other programs that are coming up here at the Archives later this month. On Monday, June 15th, we'll observe Magna Carta Day here at the National Archives. At noon here in the McGowan Theater, we'll offer a lecture by Seton Hall Professor of Political Science Robert Polito, author of In the Shadow of the Great Charter, Common Law, Constitutionalism, and Magna Carta. In it, Polito shows the Magna Carta's legacy in the United States reaches back to the nation's founding, with even the colonial charters reflecting its influence and principles. From 1:30 to 2:30, after the program, we'll celebrate the 800th anniversary with a cake, of course. Free Magna Carta cake will be served to the first 200 people. And that evening at 7, join us again here in the theater for a discussion on Magna Carta and the Constitution by a panel of experts on the two documents. They'll discuss Magna Carta's influence on our constitutional law, the Founding Fathers, and the law today. And if you don't know, the reason we're so happy to be celebrating Magna Carta is that we have the 1297 version upstairs in the David Rubenstein Gallery. If you want to know about more about these and all of our public programs, please refer to our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it either by regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. Henry William Brands is a man of the American West. Born in Oregon, earned graduate degrees in mathematics and history in Oregon and Texas. He taught at Vanderbilt University and Texas A&M University before going to the University of Texas at Austin, where he holds the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History. Professor Brands teaches history and writing to graduate students and undergraduates. He's written several dozen books on American history and politics and is no stranger to the bestseller list. Two of his books, Traitor to His Class about FDR and The First American about Benjamin Franklin, were finalists for a Pulitzer Prize. He's also written on Ulysses S. Grant, Andrew Jackson, Woodrow Wilson, and Theodore Roosevelt. He lectures frequently on historical and current events and can be seen and heard on national and international television and radio. And he has spoken several times over the years here at the National Archives. For his latest book, Reagan, the Life, Professor Brands used records held by the National Archives. At the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, he researched Reagan's handwritten correspondence, minutes of meetings, memoranda of conversations with foreign leaders, edited speeches, and much more. This new book has drawn praise from a number of sources. Matthew Dallek wrote in the Washington Post that Reagan's legacy continues to fuel the ideas and frame the choices facing his would-be successors, and this astute biography is further evidence that the 40th president continues to cast a long shadow over a still largely conservative political order. Please welcome H.W. Brands to the stage.
Thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be back at the National Archives because I can say that none of the books that I've written in this series, of which Reagan is the last, would have been possible without the records at the National Archives. So keep up the great work and make it possible for people like me to do what I do. The book that I'm going to talk about today, Reagan, the Life, is in fact the sixth and final volume of a series that I started about 20 years ago. And it was originally planned as a history of the United States in, I was thinking, 5 or 6 volumes. And I pitched the idea to a publisher who just sort of laughed in my face, saying, in these days, nobody writes that kind of work of history, and if you wrote that, nobody would buy it, nobody would read it. And this particular publisher said, and I will be able to guess the ages of some of you by your reaction to this. The publisher said, "Who do you think you are anyway, Will Durant?" Okay, the few of you who chuckled know who Will Durant was. Will and Ariel Durant wrote The Story of Civilization, a history of humanity, in about 25 volumes. And I knew that the answer that I was expected to give was no, of course not. But the real answer was, yeah, I want to be. Because I read not all of those volumes, but a lot of them. And I was very intrigued and quite charmed by the idea that you could be guided through a broad sweep of history by a single guide. I had already been in the business of teaching history long enough to know that certainly in American history, the work of, say, a broad survey of American history is parceled out to typically 4, 5, or 6 different authors. Now, I naively originally thought that was because in the academic world, the expertise is apportioned. So you'd find the colonial expert to write on the colonial period, then the expert on the early national period, and so on. And that is indeed part of the reason. After I got into the business myself as a co-author of one of these books, I also discovered that the more mercenary reason is that the more authors you get on the title page, the more of their graduate students are teaching in various places around the country who might actually adopt the book. So I did not want to write history by committee. I wanted to do it myself, and I realized it was rather ambitious, but I decided to go ahead after absorbing and sort of thinking my way through the initial discouragement from this publisher at the idea of doing it. And I decided that I wouldn't do it head on. I would do it in the form of a series of biographies. And this because I looked at the bestseller list and I saw that it's relatively rare to see something on the bestseller list that says a history of this or a history of that. But there are lots of biographies that make the bestseller list. People like biographies. So I thought what I would do is I would write this history of the United States, but I would do it under the guise of, in the form of, a series of biographies. And the first volume in the series was about Benjamin Franklin. And in fact, I came and spoke here about Benjamin Franklin now 15 or 20 years ago. And I've had the honor to come back and speak about a number of the books in the series, of which the final one is Ronald Reagan. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I wrote about Ronald Reagan and not perhaps somebody else. And it has to do with the fact that, in the first place, the volume in the series before this, Volume 5, Reagan is Volume 6. Volume 5 is about Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. So I needed someone who can pick up the story, who could pick up the story in 1945. And I wanted somebody who would get me as close to the present as reasonably possible. After having written 5 volumes in the series, I wanted to end it with 6. I didn't want to have to do 7. So that ruled out certain other potential candidates. When I started the series, I did not intend, I didn't even expect that most of the biographies would be of presidents. In fact, Volume 1 is about Benjamin Franklin. I've sometimes been asked, why was Benjamin Franklin not president? And the short answer was that he died. But he died, just as George Washington was being inaugurated, the first president. There's a deeper reason. He didn't have the personality to be president. But the subsequent books in this series have turned out to be presidents. And this primarily because of the way I conceived of the series in the first place. It was going to be a history of the United States. And so I needed biographical subjects who occupied some place near the center of American public life. If I had chosen an inventor or a poet, an artist of some sort, then I would really be testing readers' patience when I went from that particular life to the broader themes of American history. And so presidents are pretty much right in the center of things, and they enable me to tell that broad story without diverging too far from the life and the career of the president. So it turned out that most of these, actually everybody after Franklin, was a president. So Andrew Jackson was Volume 2, Ulysses Grant was Volume 3, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and finally Ronald Reagan. Now again, back to the reason for Reagan. With each of these books, I tried to associate with the individual with, or more precisely, I tried to choose the individual to somehow epitomize what I conceived in my head as the central task of American history during this particular period. So my book on Benjamin Franklin is called The First American, because it seemed to me the central theme of American history during the 18th century was the emergence of an American identity. Benjamin Franklin, like everybody else of his generation, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, you name it, they were all born Englishmen, and they died Americans. So how did this happen? My book on Andrew Jackson was about the emergence of American democracy. So Jackson, and by the way, Jackson is 23 years old in the year that Benjamin Franklin dies. So one of my considerations is that I want my figures to be stepping onto the adult stage as the previous figure steps off. And this is partly because, as a biographer, I will be the first to confess that I don't do childhoods very well. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on people's childhoods. And this is, maybe it's my personal taste. I have written biographies in which there are the obligatory darling letters from little Franklin Roosevelt to his mother. And there are lots of them that I could have chosen from, but one or two make the point. And let's get on to the adult life. So I deliberately arranged it so that my figures would be adults by the time they have to take over from the previous one, that by the time they receive the baton from the previous one. So Jackson is 23 when Franklin dies. Ulysses Grant is, in fact, 23 when Andrew Jackson dies. Theodore Roosevelt is just, he's 3 or 4 years out of college when Ulysses Grant dies. And so on, we get down to Franklin Roosevelt, who dies in 1945. So I want somebody who's an adult and is sort of embarked on life at that point. I need somebody as well who seems to me to summarize what happens in America in the second half of the 20th century. I thought about Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is a president who was central to the Civil Rights Revolution that remade American society in the second half of the 20th century. And he would have been a good choice, except for two things. Number one, Robert Caro has pretty much stolen Lyndon Johnson from everybody else until he finishes. Now, I think, in fact, that as soon as Caro finishes, there will be room for a one-volume on Lyndon Johnson. But Caro is kind of dominating the Johnson market, and I'm not going to step into that one. But even if that weren't the case, for my purposes, Johnson steps off the stage too soon. He leaves the White House in 1969. He dies in 1973. And there's still a quarter century to go in the 20th century. I thought about Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, he carries the story a little bit farther forward, but there's a problem with actually, there's an enticement with Richard Nixon, but there's a problem with Richard Nixon. The enticement for the biographer is that Nixon has that dark streak in his personality that biographers really like. As Tolstoy said, all happy families are alike and boring. It's the unhappy ones. And so it's the unhappy individuals, the ones who have that dark streak, that are appealing to the biographer. But they are not necessarily appealing to the biographer's publisher. Because just as there is a rule with Broadway musicals, you know you've got a success when the audience comes out whistling the theme song. Okay? Well, publishers like it if your readers can be doing the equivalent. If they're whistling, and I couldn't imagine, and when I talked about this with my publisher, I couldn't get them to imagine anybody who would be whistling, I don't know what the Watergate theme song would be. If you leave them on a down note, then they don't go tell all their friends what a wonderful book this is, and everybody ought to go read it to be uplifted. It might be instructive, but it wouldn't be uplifting. I may circle back and do Nixon. But I wound up with Ronald Reagan, in part because his dates, the period of his life work really well for me. He lives into the 21st century. He lives till 2004. But the other reason is that, Well, two other reasons, and they're related. I had just written about Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt is the iconic president for the first half of the 20th century. Franklin Roosevelt, more than any other president, is the one who is associated with the creation of the modern American welfare state. He is the liberal launch of the age of liberalism. You could call it the age of Franklin Roosevelt. It starts in the 1930s, and I would say continues through the 1960s. There's a direct line from the New Deal in the 1930s through the Great Society of the 1960s. And the essence of the New Deal and of the Great Society is the liberal belief that when there are important social problems, government, preeminently the federal government, is the agency of choice. It's the solver of first resort. So when there's a big problem, when the economy is in depression in the 1930s and lots of people need relief, turn to Washington. In the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson wants to deal with civil rights, when Lyndon Johnson wants to launch a war on poverty, Johnson and all the people who voted for him, all the people who voted for Franklin Roosevelt, the roughly 59% who voted for Roosevelt in 1936, the almost 60% who voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964, they say, yes, government is the solution to our problems, and that's where we will look. That attitude changed. It was changing during the 1970s, and it was decisively reversed when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. And so, in fact, in his first inaugural address, Ronald Reagan famously said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And I would argue to you that this is the attitude that has predominated the American political conversation ever since. It's not that there haven't been any new programs, new federal programs, between 1980 and now, but if you compare the number that were created between the 1930s and 1980, when new federal programs came often and they came easily, to what has been accomplished on that realm since 1980. They come seldom and they come hard, with the fate of Obamacare, which is still hanging in the balance 5 years after it has passed, being a good example of this. So if there is one individual, I think, who embodies the conservative turn in American politics in the second half of the 20th century, it's Ronald Reagan. And having written about Roosevelt, I felt sort of obliged, intellectually, academically, and historically, to look at the counterpart to Franklin Roosevelt. And I convinced myself, and I hope to convince the readers of the book, that one way of looking at Roosevelt and Reagan is that they are sort of the two parentheses of the American century. Roosevelt's the left parenthesis, and Reagan is the right parenthesis. So that's why I wrote about Ronald Reagan. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I discovered, or at least what I concluded. I'm not going to tell you everything because, of course, I want you to read and write and buy the book. But I'm going to share with you some of the experiences that I had in doing research for the book. But the first thing I'm going to do is tell you a story. And this is a story that relates to Ronald Reagan when he was the least likely political hero in the United States. In fact, this is Reagan during what I call to myself his wilderness years. A brief summary of Reagan's biography till then. Reagan was born in Illinois. He grew up in the small town of Dixon. He went off to college in Eureka, Illinois. He went from there into radio in the Midwest. He found his way to Hollywood, and he had a modestly successful film career. But it was only modestly successful. He never quite cracked the top of the marquee. He was okay at playing easy roles. He didn't have it within him to play the really tough, the really dramatic roles. And I'm going to give you a little bit of, I don't claim the insight myself. This is how I explain that. And it has to do with some of the research that I did. But it was research that came from a direction that I didn't expect at all. It wasn't something I found in the records at the National Archives. It was something that I'll tell you how I learned. I was doing a book tour for an earlier book. In fact, the last published book that I was doing was Ulysses Grant. And I was doing an interview with a radio host. And I believe the host was in Chicago. And we were having this interview. And as often happens toward the end of the interview, it was an hour-long interview, and people called in. But toward the end, the host asked me what my next project was. What are you working on now? And I said I was working on Ronald Reagan. And the host, at that point, put his hand over the microphone, and he said, when we get off the air, there's something I want to tell you. I said, okay, good. I had no reason to expect that he was an expert on things relating to Ronald Reagan, but maybe as a fellow Midwesterner or something like that, there was some insight he was going to share. So we get off, and I'm all ears. And he said, if you want to understand Ronald Reagan, what you need to remember is that Ronald Reagan was the son of an alcoholic father. Now, when he told me this, it was no particular news. Reagan himself reported on this in his memoirs. And so I was waiting for him to say more, because he wasn't giving me new information. He went on to say, however, I speak on this subject as the son of an alcoholic father. And I will tell you that there is a characteristic emotional style that people in that situation grow up with. And here's the way it works. So this is what he was telling me. He said, one day your father is your best friend, and you're throwing the baseball around in the backyard, and he's telling you funny stories, and he takes you out for ice cream. And the next day, he's beating the living daylights out of you. And every day of your boyhood, when you wake up, you don't know which father you're going to be dealing with. And as a result of this, my host was saying, you grow up keeping people and emotions at a distance, because the one person who should be your role model, the one who should be the one who shows you how to deal with emotions, is someone who is utterly and sometimes violently unreliable. Now, I heard this, and I thought, okay, I'll tuck this away and see what I can do with it. And at that point, I went back and I reread Reagan's memoir, and I reread Nancy Reagan's memoir. And the first thing that struck me was a passage from Nancy Reagan's memoir, just a sentence, where she said that, now I'll tell you that Reagan and Nancy Reagan were so close emotionally to each other that they were almost the entire emotional universe, one to the other. And no one understood Ronald Reagan better than Nancy Reagan, and probably vice versa. But Nancy Reagan said in her memoir, which I recommend to you, it's called My Turn. It was published in the early 1990s. It is one of the most candid memoirs of anybody in American public life in the last 50 years, at least that I've encountered. And she said that as close as she was to her husband, whom she always called Ronnie, as close as I was to Ronnie, there were those moments when that curtain came down, and even I didn't know what was going through his head, what was going through his heart. So for Nancy Reagan to admit that about her husband, to state that about her husband, I thought was quite striking. But there was another passage, this from Reagan's own memoir, that I found maybe even more striking. And again, it's just a sentence or two. And if I had read it before, and it didn't mean as much to me as it did this second time, after having this conversation with my radio host. There's a moment that Reagan describes when he's a boy. He's maybe 11 or 12 years old, living in Illinois, and coming home from school on a cold winter afternoon. And there's snow on the ground. The temperature is below zero. And he walks up to the house. And just as he's about to walk up the walkway to the house, he almost trips over his father, passed out drunk in the snow. And as Reagan, he's writing this at the age of 80, so he's looking back 7 decades. And he remarks that I stood there for a moment and I asked myself, what should I do? Should I wake my father and get him inside to where it was warm? Or should I just walk on by and leave him there lying in the snow? Now, for a young boy, even for a moment, to be considering, should I just leave my dad out here in the snow and let him freeze to death? Would my life be better if my father were dead? That strikes me as quite a significant revelation. Now, Reagan in his memoir doesn't make much of it, and he quickly goes on. In fact, the rest of the memoir is about how his mother had told him and his brother that their father had this disease, and this was the way he was made to understand what alcoholism was. It's a disease, your father's not responsible for this, so don't hold it against him. But clearly at some level he was holding against this. Anyway, so this was one of the things that I kept in mind in observing Reagan, watching Reagan, and in answering the question, it's kind of the basic question in all of this is, so how did Ronald Reagan accomplish what he accomplished? Now, I'll get to what he accomplished, but I'm actually going to come around to the story I'm going to tell you. And so Reagan goes off to Hollywood, and his film career gets about this high, but then it gradually fades out, in part because he couldn't go to those emotional well springs that actors have to go to. If you're going to convey emotion, you have to have some emotion inside yourself that you're willing to access so you can play that part in your role. But he couldn't go there. And so, in fact, when anticipating a little bit, when Reagan decided to go into politics, he announced that he was going to run for governor of California. And Samuel Goldwyn of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the Hollywood insider, heard that Reagan was running for governor. And he said, no, you got it all wrong. Jimmy Stewart for governor, Ronald Reagan for best friend. That's the kind of role that Reagan played. Anyway, even at that level, his film career fizzled out by the early 1950s. He was demoted from the big screen to the small screen, the tiny screen of television, which was a serious demotion. And not only that, so he had a 3-minute gig every Sunday night. He was host of the GE Theater. And he would just introduce this sort of made-for-TV play, and then that was the end of it. For the rest of the week, he was a spokesman. He was basically the flack man for the General Electric Company. For 8 years during the 1950s, Reagan was essentially a walking infomercial. And this was what his career had come to. And then in the early 1960s, he lost even that job. And he managed to find a role as host of Death Valley Days. But there was no future for this guy in showbiz. And his life had been show business of one sort or another. And he had no idea what the future was going to bring. Now, anybody who had looked at Ronald Reagan in 1963, before he went into politics, would have been hard-pressed to identify any of those talents, any of those ambitions, any of those character traits that make for political greatness. You could do a lineup of 10 people, sort of any 10 people off the street and include Reagan, and say, okay, so which one is going to change the American political world? And you'd have a hard time saying this is the guy. Now, as the biographer, I know what he became, and as is the case with a lot of biographies, you don't narratively start at the end and work backwards, but you conceptually do. The reason I wrote about Ronald Reagan was because he became president of the United States. If Reagan had dropped dead at the age of 52, neither I nor anyone else would have thought about writing a biography of Ronald Reagan. It's because he became this person who changed American politics, and I would say changed world affairs as well, that we're interested in the first half of his life. But you look back at the first half of his life, and it's really hard to figure out what it is in that that gives rise to this thing that's going to become. So the fundamental question that I had is, how did he do it? How did this person of unremarkable talents, presence, and everything else accomplish what he did? Now I am going to tell you the story. So here's the story. Reagan is in the middle of his career, these 8 years, where he gives talks on behalf of General Electric. So sometimes the talks are in GE plants. Very often they're lunchtime talks to the Rotary Club, the Chamber of Commerce, the Alex, the Kiwanis, you name it. And he always called it the Rubber Chicken Tour. And he was often introduced by people who had never met him before. And people who, in particular, in the case of this particular story, the guy who's going to introduce him is someone who has never met Ronald Reagan. In fact, has only seen the name in print. And so he's a little bit uncertain as to how the last name is pronounced. It's spelled R-E-A-G-A-N. And is it Reagan or is it Regan? All right. So in this story, our introducer is puzzling over this question on the morning before he's going to give the introduction at noon. And he's getting kind of anxious because he doesn't want to make a fool of himself in front of all of his friends and mispronounce the guest's name. So he's wandering around his neighborhood. He's walking around the neighborhood, thinking this over. And he encounters somebody else who apparently lives in the neighborhood as well, one of the neighbors, who's walking his dog. And this guy's walking the dog, and it's some kind of small hound-like dog. And so the guy who's going to make the introduction asks the guy walking on the street, the neighbor, "Here, I've got this problem. Do you happen to know how this guy's name is pronounced?" And he shows him, Ronald, R-E-A-G-A-N. And the guy walking the dog says, "Oh, yeah, it's Reagan. It's Ronald Reagan. Reagan. Now, you're sure it's Reagan? It's not Regan? It's Reagan. Yeah, Reagan." Boy, that is a relief, because I was really afraid that I was going to get it wrong and get embarrassed. So, Reagan. And he starts walking away saying, "Reagan, Reagan." And just as he's walking past the guy, he says, "Oh, by the way, that's a really cute dog you got. What kind of dog is that?" "It's a Bagel." So, this was a story that Ronald Reagan told on himself. Now, the reason I'm telling you is that this is part of the answer, and it's going to sound really prosaic, but it's part of the answer to how Ronald Reagan accomplished what he accomplished. Now, I'm not going to give you the full blow-by-blow of my interpretation of how Reagan accomplished what he accomplished. First, I will tell you what he accomplished. And before I do that, I'm going to make a disclaimer. Those of us who are in the biography business, we often use a shorthand. And those of us in particular who write presidential biographies, we tend to say or speak as though the things that happened during the presidency of the person that we're writing about were accomplished by the person we're writing about. Now, I'm going to be the first to acknowledge that that is not universally true. Sometimes it's not even mostly true. Lyndon Johnson did not effect the civil rights revolution by himself, by any means. Martin Luther King had something to do with this, and all those people who marched and demonstrated and the people who got beaten over the head, they had lots to do with it as well. However, there was, in the 1960s, an essential role for a president in guiding that legislation through Congress. Likewise, I'm going to say that Ronald Reagan changed the American political conversation, that it had been moving in a liberal direction since Franklin Roosevelt. Since Ronald Reagan, it's been moving back in the other direction. I will tell you what Reagan set out to accomplish, and I'll give you my scorecard on what he did accomplish. Reagan, one of the secrets of Reagan's success was the fact that he focused very narrowly on a very small set of goals. In particular, Ronald Reagan had 2 goals that he reiterated every time he gave a speech. By the way, I begin my book with what those people who like Ronald Reagan and those people who worked around Reagan simply call the speech. And it's a speech he gave on behalf of Barry Goldwater in the autumn of 1964, a week before the election of 1964, when Goldwater was clearly going to lose, and lose badly, to Lyndon Johnson. But in order to raise some money to keep the Goldwater campaign from ending too deeply in debt, and maybe to energize Republicans to go to the polls a little bit, the Goldwater campaign agreed to put this political novice on TV. Ronald Reagan had been giving some speeches in Southern California. He seemed to give a pretty good speech, so they put him on TV. And it's really not an exaggeration to say that 30 minutes before Reagan went on television on that October night in 1964, the nation, well, those few people who can remember Ronald Reagan as an actor, the few, but nobody thought of Reagan as this political figure. Almost nobody. 30 minutes before he went on TV that night. And by the time that 30-minute speech ended, there were lots of Republicans who were smacking their foreheads and saying, we nominated the wrong candidate. If we had nominated this guy, we might have a chance of winning. In fact, the story of Republican conservatism, which is really a story of modern conservatism, is how Ronald Reagan went from that reaction. So the day before he gave that speech, no one had heard of him. The very next day, there were Ronald Reagan for President committees being formed around the country. He'd never run for any political office at all, but he started thinking about it. Anyway, so Ronald Reagan's two goals articulated in that speech and pretty much every speech he gave for the 25 years of his political life reiterated the same two themes. Number one, shrink government at home. Number two, defeat communism abroad. One of the secrets of Reagan's success was his insistence on focusing on those two goals. Now, I told you I was going to give you a scorecard. How did he do on these two goals? I will say that he got 1.5 of them. He got 1.5 of his two goals. The one that he got, again, not all by himself, but the one that he got completely was to defeat communism. Reagan pushed Soviet communism to the brink of dissolution. And when Reagan gave that speech before the Brandenburg Gate in 1987, he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The wall didn't come down right away, but it had come down within the next 2 years, and it was followed by the demise of the Soviet Union. Now, of course, Mikhail Gorbachev had a lot to do with this. The elder George Bush had a lot to do with the fact that the Soviet Union dissolved peacefully, that it went out with a whimper rather than a bang. But if there's a central figure in this drama, certainly pushing from the American side, it's Ronald Reagan. So I'm going to give him, he gets 1 out of 1 on that one. He gets half out of 1 on the goal of shrinking government at home. And the way he only got half of this is very significant for the way we live today. When Ronald Reagan became president, the litmus test for Republican conservatives on fiscal issues was the balanced budget. Households have to balance their budget, match the income with the outgo. Government needs to do the same thing. Reagan entered office as that kind of traditional fiscal conservative. But during the course of his first term, he made a fateful decision to accept tax cuts without insisting on spending cuts. Now, Reagan proposed a budget to Congress in his first budget message. He said, I want to cut taxes, I want to cut spending. And what he got was guarantees of tax cuts, bringing the top marginal rate from 70% down to below 30%. It's crept back up a little bit since then. But he got the tax cuts, and he could almost literally take those to the bank. He got promises for spending cuts. But promises of spending cuts, any political realist knows that as much as certain groups in Congress might complain about tax cuts, they don't really complain that hard because they know that when they're running for re-election, if they tell their constituents, guess what, I cut your taxes, people don't complain about having their taxes cut. Spending cuts are a lot harder. Reagan did not get the spending cuts. He got the tax cuts. What did the country get? The country got structural deficits that have been a very large problem ever since the Reagan years. Reagan, not surprisingly, blamed the Democrats in Congress, blamed Tip O'Neill. They just wouldn't go along with me. Well, he should have known. He did know. But he didn't act on the fact that when you make political compromises, you have to insist that the two parts of the compromise stick together. If you separate them, then you might get part of it. You're not going to get the other part. So anyway, so this is what Reagan accomplished. How did he accomplish it? Well, I'm running out of time. I want to leave time for questions, so I will make this relatively brief. And I will tell you, I realize that this is not a particularly Republican city. I spoke in Dallas a couple of nights ago. They were really interested in what I'm about to say. But you are all interested in politics, I assume. So I'm going to tell you the formula, and you can share it if you want, or you can just bury it if you don't want to. This is a formula for how the Republicans can reclaim the White House in 2016. Okay? And it goes like this. Well, you should be as much like Ronald Reagan as you can be. And what is it about Ronald Reagan that conservatives today should emulate? That is, if you want to get elected. The first thing is speak conservatively 100% of the time. Ronald Reagan, in that first speech in 1964 to his farewell address in 1989, was 100% conservative. And this is why Ronald Reagan, even today, is an icon of the Republican Party. Because everybody from just right of center to the most zealous of the Tea Party activists can read Reagan's speeches. They can watch Reagan's speeches on YouTube. And it is almost chapter and verse, the conservative message that conservatives embraced ever since. So if you like, I'll call it rhetorical conservatism, Reagan is your guy. You cannot hear him, you cannot read him, make any kind of slip from that 100% consistent conservative message. So, that's the thing you want to do in your speeches. But there's something else you need to do. You need to, well, this is why I told you a little story about Reagan and the bagel. You need to learn how to make people laugh, learn how to make people smile. I realize this sounds minor, it sounds prosaic, but one of the secrets of Reagan's success was, well, it was something he learned during those wilderness years on the rubber chicken circuit. He would speak before audiences he didn't know, audiences that might, as far as he knew, they could have been skeptical, they could have been hostile, but he would always warm them up with a story, a joke. And in fact, if you read Reagan's speeches while he's in the White House, nearly every one begins with a joke. Now, what's the purpose? The purpose is to get people to laugh. Because Reagan learned when he was speaking in all those places in the Midwest and everywhere else, that if you can get people to laugh with you, you're halfway to getting them to agree with you. But there's a larger message here, and that is that Reagan, I don't know if Reagan thought this through. He was not a particularly reflective guy. It may have simply been instinctual with him. It may have reflected his career in Hollywood, where he was a celebrity, where he wanted people to like him. Some of you are, some of you know, conservatives. And I don't mean to stereotype conservatives, but I will say, and you can decide for yourself whether what I say is accurate. But I would say that most conservatives tend to be pessimists. I would say a lot of them come across as grouchy, even as angry, righteously indignant. Now, I think you'll have to agree with me at least regarding the pessimism, because the definition of a conservative is a person who is distrustful of change. And, if you're distrustful of change, you think that change is usually for the worse. But I would just say in American politics, in American conservatism, there is this stern, often angry, emotional undercurrent. And I'll give you the example that was foremost in American thinking at the time Reagan came on the scene. Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater's philosophy was no different than Ronald Reagan's philosophy. Maybe I should put it the other way around. Reagan's philosophy was no different than Goldwater's philosophy. But their visage, their appearance to the American people could not have been more different. Barry Goldwater was stern. Barry Goldwater lectured. Barry Goldwater was scary to a lot of people. And the Johnson campaign went to town on that. Reagan, by contrast, Reagan's this friendly guy. Reagan's this likable guy. Reagan tells jokes. Reagan smiles. Reagan is conservatism with a friendly face. Reagan, in fact, Reagan was that rare. I'm going to say almost unique in American experience, example of an optimistic conservative. Reagan said again and again, and he thoroughly believed, that America is the shining city on a hill. And it's going to get more shining as time goes on. Again and again, including on his tombstone, as his epitaph, Reagan said that America's best days are ahead. Now, for somebody to say that in the 1970s, late 1970s, when he's running for president, after the 1960s and the 1970s, which between the Vietnam War, the riots of the 1960s, Watergate, the stagflation of the 1970s, it wasn't the most natural thing. Remember Jimmy Carter and the so-called malaise speech, where he says, we got these problems, we need to look within because there's something wrong in there. Reagan said, no, it's not. America's best days are ahead. So here's how the Republican candidate can win. Take that conservative message, but put a smile on it. Be friendly, be appealing. So I'm just thinking that, if Ted Cruz could have a character transplant, he's your guy. Anyway, I will stop there and take questions that might have occurred to you, or objections for that matter. And there are microphones here for the questions.
So, shortly after Reagan came to Washington in 1980, Clark Clifford, that longtime Democrat fixer, attorney, Truman, Johnson administration figure, opined that Reagan was nothing more than an amiable dunce. You remember that quote?
Yes.
Would you speak to that and
I can.
the truth or
Sure.
not truth of that?
Yes. Well, he definitely got half of it right. Reagan was amiable. Actually, I'll elaborate on that a little bit, because Reagan did have that emotional reserve that I talked about. Reagan seemed to be amiable from a distance. He seemed like the friendly guy. If you saw him on television, you'd think, oh, here's somebody that I'd like to get to know, like to have a beer with. But in fact, the closer people got to Reagan, the more they realized that there was this coolness at his heart. Reagan had almost no friends, aside from Nancy. There were people that he associated with, but he never let his guard down sufficiently to let people close. About the dunce part, I became convinced, first of all, that Reagan was no dummy. He knew a lot more than people thought he knew. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I got. I did interviews with pretty much every surviving senior member of the cabinet. And I will share with you what they told me. And there's almost in the same words, everyone that I talked to. And I'll let you decide what to make of it. Usually within the first 5 minutes, they assured me that they would say, Ronald Reagan was a lot smarter than people thought he was. And I thought, okay, that tells me something. But when they say, then people thought he was, because people didn't think he was very smart at all. Clark Clifford thought he was a dunce. So if he's smarter than a dunce, is this damning with faint praise? None of them said he was the smartest person I ever met. And this also was, well, in fact, so Robert Gates was talking to me. He was the number 2 guy in the CIA during the Reagan administration. Of course, he later went on to other things. But Gates told me that he thought that Reagan deliberately downplayed how much he knew, because Reagan liked to keep those expectations low. He could sneak up on people this way. But I will tell you that Reagan knew enough, and he didn't know too much. And I think this is actually important if you are going to effect change from the position of the presidency. And in many ways, Jimmy Carter is the one who shows what happens when you know too much, because Carter became notorious for micromanaging. Carter, I'm sure, on an IQ test, Carter came out much higher than Reagan. And Carter was one who thought he ought to master all the details of policy. Well, the federal government, even the executive branch, is a big thing. And if you try to master everything, if you spread yourself too thin, you get nothing at all. The secret of Reagan's success was his focus on these 2 particular items. And when Reagan wanted to focus on those particular areas, he knew enough. And I can testify this, having read the transcripts of Reagan's negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev. and I spent a lot of time on the weekend at Reykjavik, where Reagan is going toe-to-toe with Gorbachev. And it is clear that neither one is a master of all of the details of what goes into each element of the nuclear arsenal. But he knew as much as Gorbachev did about this, and he knew that he had his experts, Kenneth Edelman and other people, who would fill in the blanks, fill in the details when necessary. So Reagan understood that you don't have to know everything to be president. You have to know enough. And then you have to know who to hire, who knows the rest. So in this case, I've long had this theory, and I have no way of knowing how to test this theory, but that if you could somehow take all of the presidential elections in history and average out the IQ of the intellectual IQ, not the emotional or social IQ or political IQ, just the standard school-based kind of IQ. If you could average out the winners against the losers, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the winning candidates wound up with the lower average IQ than the losing candidates. And this just simply goes to show, I guess you could say, it shows the limits on IQ as a measure of important stuff, but it also goes to show a couple of things. One is that ordinary American voters are not necessarily drawn to the smartest person in the room. And secondly, that kind of intelligence does not necessarily conduce to effective results as president. You can hire smart people. You can't hire judgment. And that's really what separates the presidents who effect change from those who don't. Yes, next question, sir.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I only began looking at some of it. As you pointed out, Reagan emphasized the importance of words and the importance of focusing. So I looked at the title, Reagan, The Life, comparing it to Reagan's second memoirs, which is a little bit less bold, right? An American Life. So I was wondering if that, the title of his second memoirs influenced your titling the book or your publisher's book. And how do you think, well, I'm sure your purpose is probably to write the definitive life of President Reagan. Of course, Mrs. Reagan really liked Luke Hannon's book, so I don't know if you want to discuss Luke Hannon's book, because,
Sure.
I mean, that's a great read, too.
Okay. The subtitle is a subtitle I did not choose. In fact, I resisted a subtitle. I wanted it just to be called Reagan. But the publisher, for some reason, thought that somehow didn't convey that this was a biography. So I don't know what else it would be, but nonetheless, so I sent it off, the manuscript, I sent it off with just Reagan. And it came back in page proof with Reagan, The Life. At which point, by the way, I long ago learned that the fine print in the standard book contract says that while the author has control over everything that goes inside the book, the author has almost no control. Sometimes the author is asked to consent to what goes on the outside of the book. And the outside of the book includes the title. The standard book contract says that the publisher, in conjunction with the author, will determine what the title is. The title is part of marketing. So actually, I happen to like it. I mean, I didn't want to put Life and Times. That's too trite. And A Life, well, they sent it back with The Life, and I said, okay, let's be assertive about this. Now, but I would not be the one to claim that this is a definitive life. And furthermore, it's way too soon for anything to be definitive about somebody like Ronald Reagan. Way too soon in the sense that we're still too close to the events. And we're too close to the events in two senses. Number one is, I'll just take you one thing. What is the meaning of the end of the Cold War? Now, if Russia, under Vladimir Putin, decides to revive this hostility with the United States, and if in 5 years those Russian missiles are, again, there's still thousands of them, are aimed at the United States, and the United States missiles are aimed at Russia, then it's going to start to look as though 1991 was not that big a deal. So we don't know exactly how all this stuff plays out. Secondly, although I made what I hoped was good use of records at the Reagan Library and records available elsewhere, there are a whole lot of records that are still not available. And they're going to be becoming available probably over the next 10, 20, 30, who knows how many years. And so it'll probably be 50 or 60 years before anything really approaching a definitive life. But there have been a couple of reviewers who've been kind enough to say that this is the definitive life for our times, and I'm not going to argue with that. Oh, Lou Cannon. Lou Cannon is the best of the first takes on Reagan. Cannon covered Reagan as a journalist from the California years through Washington. And Cannon, for obvious reasons, this is his interest, this was his beat, focuses on the political life. And he has two big volumes. One is President Reagan, one is Governor Reagan. And each one is as fat as my whole life. Cannon gives relatively short attention to Reagan before he goes into politics. So mine, in this case, maybe that's why the publisher said the life, because it really does include the first 50 years. With Cannon, it's mostly 50 to 94. And yes, sir, your turn.
In this town, it's pretty easy to run into people who have met with Reagan. And I've talked to quite a few folks who did meet with him in the White House, and they all tell the same story, that when they would go in for those meetings, he would read something to them. And then when they got to the question and answers, he would turn to one of his aides or a cabinet official and say, well, what, Cap, why don't you take that? Or George, why don't you? And that's always made me wonder, how much, beyond the two big ideas, how much of the Reagan agenda was his agenda, or did he just continue to be a walking infomercial as president for someone else?
Very good question. I would say that the agenda was Reagan's, but the details on those other issues were filled in by other people. And I'll give you sort of the extreme example that turned out badly. But we could look at the ones that turned out reasonably well from a Republican conservative perspective. Deregulation of large parts of the economy. Reagan believed that the economy was too regulated as of 1980, and that regulations ought to be lifted to, as Reagan would have said, to unleash the independent spirit, the entrepreneurship of the American people. But Reagan didn't get down into the details of what was going to be deregulated and when. This is the basic principle. Now you guys put it into operation. But the particular area in which Reagan's inattention to detail blew up in his face, and even he would have acknowledged this, was in the Iran-Contra scandal. And the Iran-Contra scandal emerged out of, I won't repeat the whole story, but I'll get the part that deals with Reagan specifically and Iran. Reagan was greatly concerned over the fate of American hostages held in Lebanon. Reagan entered the White House while there were 52 American hostages held in Iran. And he made a big deal against Jimmy Carter for not effecting the release of the hostages. So those hostages were released on the day that Reagan was inaugurated, but over the course of the next few years, several Americans were taken hostage in Lebanon by Hezbollah, which was supported by the government of Iran. And Reagan became closely involved in negotiations to attempt the release of the hostages, even to the details of sending weapons to Tehran, in the hopes that that would help spring the American hostages in Lebanon. Now, here I'm going to tell you a little bit of the sources that I used. I had access to Reagan's diary, and in Reagan's diary, it's really clear that he understands the connection between the arms shipments to Iran and the release of the hostages. Time and again, he writes, okay, so the current plan is we send them a new shipment of anti-tank missiles, and they release 2 hostages. Now, in fact, it's always written in the future tense and perspective, because they sent the weapons, the hostages didn't get released. But then he would go on and say, okay, we got a new deal, now more weapons, and they're going to release the hostages finally. And in Reagan's diary, this is in Reagan's own hand, it's clear he knows there's hostages, arms for hostages. But he's not paying attention to sort of the details of the arms shipments. And in particular, he's not paying attention to the connection between the profits from the arms sales to Iran and the money that's going to the Contras. So that's the Contra side of the Iran-Contra connection. Now, one comment about first the hostages and then about the Contra connection. About the hostages, when some of you will remember, when Reagan went on television after the Iran-Contra story broke. And he got up in front of the American people, speaking from the Oval Office, and he swore that this was not arms for hostages. And if you look at him, if you listen to his voice, if you read the body language, he certainly sounds sincere. Now, if Reagan had been a better actor than he was, I might have been willing to say, okay, he was just acting, and he fooled all of us. But I think it was something more, at one level, complicated than that, but also simpler than that. That Reagan had this deep-seated belief that the United States never did anything wrong, at least not wrong for long. Now, some of this I got from talking to Ron Reagan, his son. And Ron was a teenager when Reagan was in politics. He was the youngest of the Reagan children. And he was of a liberal mind and kind of rebellious. And he used to kind of poke and prod his father. And Ron Reagan tells the story about how they were watching a movie one day. Reagan liked to watch movies. He really liked Westerns. And they were watching a Western in which the Indians were getting beaten up on the way Indians did in American history. And Ron asked his father, sort of pointed out to his father, that the Indians really got a bad deal from the United States government. Don't you think so, Dad? And he said it made his father uncomfortable. So when he was talking, because Reagan didn't want to believe that this greatest country on earth ever did stuff that was basically wrong, consistently wrong. So when I was talking to Ron Reagan, he said, my father was no dummy, sort of echoes of he was smarter than people gave him credit for. He said, my father was no dummy. And he knew, for example, that slavery was an evil institution, and it was it was legal in the United States for 300 years. So my father knew that there was this dark aspect of American history. But between what he knew and what he felt, there was this gap. And so when Reagan is talking about we didn't trade arms for hostages, there is part of Reagan, the part that wrote the diary, that knew there was this linkage. But there was this other part that says, no, the United States doesn't do that kind of thing. Now, in Reagan's defense, if defense is appropriate here, he might have said, well, the arms were going to Tehran, and the hostages were in Lebanon. The hostage holders weren't getting any arms themselves. Now, he knew the linkage. And if any Democrat had used that against him, he would have said, that's absurd. Of course, but it was absurd, but it is the kind of thing that I think he believed. And it's not, I've seen this in other people in politics, and you've probably seen it in perhaps your own life and the lives of people around you. It's one thing to know something. It's another thing to feel it or believe it. And oftentimes people live in this state of cognitive dissonance where they know one thing, but they act as though this other thing is actually the real deal. Now, the question was sort of the details of policy. Reagan, I'm convinced, did not know that the profits from the arms sales were being diverted to the Contras. And I say this on the basis of, first of all, the reaction that Reagan made, the reaction that he had when he was informed by Ed Meese that there had been this diversion. And everybody who saw Reagan said that his face went white, and he was shocked by this. But beyond this, I talked to John Poindexter, who was the National Security Advisor at the time. And I asked him the question this way. I said, did you feel as though you were kind of hung out to dry as a result of, because when the story broke, it was Poindexter and Oliver North who were fired. And Reagan, the Teflon president, waltzes away. And Poindexter said, no, I wasn't resentful. I wasn't bitter at all. That was my job. My job was to protect the president from stuff he didn't want to know, from stuff he shouldn't know. So I didn't tell him that the money was being diverted to the Contras. Actually, Poindexter told me one other thing. And this is, and maybe this I'm anticipating a question. By 1986, Reagan was 75 years old, 76 years old by the end of the year. And he was, the question came up later whether the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, which Reagan announced to the public in 1994, whether there were any symptoms of that earlier on. Some people thought that they saw things as early as 1984. Some of you perhaps remember the first debate between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. And in the first debate, Reagan did not acquit himself well at all. Here's the guy who was the trained actor, who knows how to memorize his lines, and he could not remember his closing statement. You know, everybody, all the candidates always memorize the opening statement and the closing statement. He tripped over it, he repeated himself. The Wall Street Journal, the friendly Wall Street Journal the next day, asked the question, they put the question in the headline, is Reagan too old to be president? Ron Reagan, writing later, said that he thought those were the initial symptoms of Alzheimer's in the father. But John Poindexter told me that he thought that one of the reasons that the Iran-Contra scandal got out of hand the way it did, that there was this stuff going on in the West Wing that Reagan wasn't aware of, was that Reagan was becoming forgetful. And people would tell him stuff, and he would forget it. Now, this would culminate in a very poignant, but also sort of scary moment when Reagan is 2 years out of the White House, and he is being asked to give evidence, to testify, in one of the Iran-Contra criminal cases. And so he gives a deposition. And in this deposition, over the course of a couple hours, he's asked a whole long list of questions. And he answers more than 80 of these questions with one form of, I don't know, I can't remember, I don't recall. And these weren't just questions of detail. These were questions as basic as, do you remember who your chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was? I don't recall. And it really got heart-wrenching when he was asked, do you remember who Michael Deaver was? Mike Deaver was Reagan's closest friend, closest political associate from way back in the California days. And he can't remember. Finally, at the end of this, Reagan says, it's almost like I was never president at all. It is really anguishing to read this because here's someone whose life, his past life, is vanishing before his eyes. It's also kind of scary that here's somebody who's only 2 years out of the White House. You know, so how much of these symptoms were there when he was in the White House? I do not use the label, the term, the word Alzheimer's until Reagan does himself. But I don't need that to demonstrate that Reagan was slowing down when he was in the White House. He worked shorter hours. He had never been a workaholic. He was never one of these people who thought that the more hours you put in would translate directly into better output. He went home at night. He went up to the residence, typically at 5:30 or 6, and that was the end of his workday. And he would often sleep in. It wouldn't come down till 9 o'clock. By the end of his term, he was not coming down till 10 o'clock, and people were just, okay, he's slowing down. Can I point to anything? Poindexter was pointing to Iran-Contra. I think there are other ways of explaining that. Can I point to any incidents, any aspects of policy that suffered because of this? I cannot. In fact, I can give you some evidence to the contrary, that when called upon, Reagan could still perform very well. His weekend with Gorbachev in Reykjavik this is in the end of 1986. And Reagan for 36 hours was, I'm going to say he was at the top of his game. Now, he couldn't sustain that for day after day after day. In fact, he called it off at the end of Sunday. The meeting was supposed to go Saturday and then just Sunday morning, and then they were going to go home. They continued to negotiate through early Sunday afternoon, then another one through late Sunday afternoon. And finally, he calls an end to it. Some of his advisors said, how about we stay overnight and come back and try to get a final agreement Monday morning, because they were very close to an agreement that would have, if followed through on, would have led to the elimination of nuclear weapons between the superpowers. But Reagan finally said, nope, I'm going home. And his explanation was, Nancy's holding Sunday dinner for me, and so I got to get back there. Have we run out of time? We probably have. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.